Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to Hamilton Place this evening. My name's Andy Rankin. I'm Secretary of the Society's Aeronautical Heritage Group. And before we start this evening's activity, just a couple of the local things here. There will not be a fire alarm test tonight, so if you do hear something, it'll be a real one. The designated assembly point is in the paved area and railed area at the junction of Hamilton Place and Piccadilly. Beyond the Intercontinental Hotel. Air Society staff, there's plenty of people around, will be on hand to guide you. And if you have any mobility or access issues, make yourself known to members of staff and they'll make the right arrangements for your safe exit. Please don't leave any unmarked bags unattended in the building, and don't forget the mobile phones if you could switch them off, please. The event is being recorded and will be available on YouTube after the event, and after the event there will be a question and answer session, but I will ask that if you've got a question, if you could just go up to the microphone so when we record it, people hear the questions as well. And so I'd like to introduce Mike Bannister and Nick Cook this evening. Mike was, as you know, a long-term Concorde pilot, trained at Hamble, which started your career at Hamble, where I finished mine 2 miles up the road at Swanwick Air Traffic Control Centre a good few years later. And then and Nick as well, Nick Cook, many years ago, Jane's Air Defence Weekly, author and consultant. So hand over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And welcome, and thank you all for coming to Mike's latest lecture on Concorde. The book, your book, Mike, came out in September last year, and I have to say it's done extremely well. I think you pipped Michael Palin at Christmas, which is
I've got Prince Harry in my sights.
you and a few others, I shouldn't wonder. It's a remarkable book. It's part memoir. It's part detective story. It's part homage to an engineering icon. What motivated you to want to write this book?
I guess I'm of the age where, if you were British Airways, you had to retire at the age of 55 as a pilot. Actually, it's not quite the truth. If you're in management like I was, you could go onto a management contract with a supplement to fly, or stay on a pilot's contract with a supplement to manage. And when I got to that point, when I joined the exec team, I thought, what do I do? So I went for advice, and I thought, I'm just going to give me advice. I know the pension people, they'll tell me. So I rang up the pension people, I explained the situation. I said, I'm terribly sorry, we can't give you any advice. We're not allowed to. But we can give you statistics. 98.2% of people in your situation stay on a pilot's contract. I thought, I know why, because next time there's a night of the long knives and you're out, and go back to flying airplanes. So I stayed as a pilot until I retired at the age of 55. Really young, so I've got lots of things left to do. And I thought, one of the things I want to do is write a book. But I got overtaken by my charitable work. I'm Vice Chair of Trustees at Brooklands. I'm Chair of an independent school. I run a charity for BA. I run a food bank and a bunch of other stuff. So I never really got around to doing it, although it was all there. And then I read a fabulous book, which I can highly recommend, called Harrier 807 by Roland White. If you haven't read it and you're interested in Harriers and or Falklands, it's a must read. I really, really enjoyed it. And at the end it said, if you've liked this book, why not contact the author at rolandwhite.com or whatever. I thought there's no point doing that, he'll never reply. But then I thought, no, I really have enjoyed this, so I will. So I sent him an email saying how wonderful I thought his book was, and P.S., I'm toying with the idea of writing my own. Didn't think any more of it. It transpires that Roland's only an author by hobby. His main job is a publishing editor for Penguin Random House, which I did not know, and I got a reply the next day saying, we better talk. And that was 3 years ago. So this is the end of the outcome of all that work.
Well, let's cut to the beginning. Here we have some shots of the very young Michael Bannister. Tell us, how did what was flying always in the blood? What when did you start?
Well, no, flying wasn't in the blood. There's no direct connection. I come from Burton-on-Trent, and my mum was one of 12, and my dad was one of 6. I've got lots of aunts and uncles. I had 6 publicans in the family and 6 train drivers. I think the publican heritage is why I'm this shape. But no direct connection with flying at all. But we always used to go down to the south coast. We lived in Bedfordshire, and we'd go down to Bournemouth for our holidays every year. But we didn't have a car, no motorways. It was always a coach journey of 5.5 hours. And I hate coach journeys to this day. And I can remember sitting on the beach at Bournemouth at the age of 7 and looking up, watching this little airplane going over to the Channel Islands or to France or wherever, and calculating with the precociousness of a 7-year-old that this trip that would have been 5.5 hours in a coach would take me 20 minutes in that aeroplane. So I toddled back up the beach with my bucket and spade and announced to Mum and Dad that I was going to be a pilot, and Mum said, yes, dear. And that was it, really. I set until I worked my way through pilot training school and joined BOAC on the VC-10, and then latterly my real dream started flying Concorde in 1977.
Well, let's dwell a little bit on that run-up to Concorde first. So, when were you at Hamble?
67 to 69.
I mean, obviously we've got chipmunks there, and then after Hamble, you joined BA at, or it was BOAC.
Indeed, it was, yeah. At Hamble, at the end of when the tranche of pilots from the Second World War worked their way through, coming up for retirement in around about 1960, that wave started retiring. The BOAC, BEA, and the Ministry of Transport, the government, set up Hamble, a third each, to train a tranche of new pilots. And each course, there were 4 courses a year, each course was 45. And we were churning out like sausages. And you were guaranteed a place with either BOAC or BEA when you graduated. You could express a preference, but you weren't guaranteed that particular preference. Fast forward to when I graduated in 1969, there'd been a downturn in the industry. Neither BOAC nor BEA wanted pilots. So when we came up to our final exams, the principal at the college did this really motivational speech to us all. He got us all, gathered us together in a room just like this and stood on a stage just like this and said, gentlemen, neither of the airlines wants you. Brilliant. You're just about to take all your 21 exams. Neither of the airlines want you. They want to get rid of you. So they've directed me to tell you anybody who fails more than 3 of those 21 papers is out. And if you fail any papers on a retake, you're out. Oh, and by the way, the air law exam is 100% pass mark. Any questions? So we went from 45 to 30 overnight, and then that 30 carried on, and we were the only course ever where all 30 of us got our choice. So 18 wanted to go to BOAC, 12 to BEA. We all got our choice because neither airline wanted us. So off to BOAC, we don't want you as a pilot was the opening thing. You know, all these sort of courses you do at the beginning as they get you into the company, onboarding courses. Well, it was all, we don't really want you. Great, feel really good. So off we go to be a navigator on the 707. And all 18 of us sitting in a classroom thinking, well, I suppose it's better than not having a job. And in comes this very senior captain dressed in his uniform, and he hands out a sheet. And he says, gentlemen, I'd like you to fill out this sheet. There are 5 questions, please check 1. I very much want to be a 707 pilot. I want to be a 707 pilot. I don't really care. I very much want to be a VC-10 pilot. I want to be a VC-10 pilot. Check them, check the questions. Of the 18, 6 of us were honest to truth and all ticked, I very much want to be a VC-10 pilot. The others ticked something else, thinking it might be some sort of loyalty test. He collected the papers in and said, right, you 6, come with me. Off we went with him, and he started a VC-10 pilot's course that afternoon. The remaining 6 remained in 707 navigators for the next 2.5 years, which taught me a life lesson, you know, always tell it like it is. So, then on to the VC-10 as a pilot, and my aspiration really was always to fly Concorde, and that opportunity came up in 1977.
And we'll get there in just a second, but it was an interesting time, wasn't it? You alluded to that already. Almost like the cusp of an era. You've got that Second World War generation of pilots sort of retiring pretty much. You've got the new generation, your generation, coming through from Hamble. So it was sort of, you were in this confluence of currents. What was that, the older generation, like to work with?
The majority of them were very characterful. And the spectrum range, there was a guy called Jeff Morrell who was charming and sweet, and he would do anything he possibly could to help you and assist you and support you, and you just sensed all the time his objective was to get you through this difficult course. You know, it was a 3 years curriculum condensed into 18 months. You only had 2 weeks off in 18 months. It was a very intense course. He was a bomber pilot. The other end of the spectrum, a guy called Bob Knights, who's also a bomber pilot, but you got the impression his objective was to, at the very least, get you kicked off the course, if not assassinated. And it turns out, of course, he's a much nicer guy than that, but that was the impression at the beginning. And they are of the generation where they just do things. You know, they're military pilots, ex-RAF, they'd fought in the war, they were bomber pilots. If there's an objective, they just go do it. Whereas the newer pilots were much more restricted by rules, regulations, and standard operating procedures and all that sort of stuff. And so I can remember the variety of approaches that were taken by the pilots. So us young sprogs, we'd come along, we'd been at Hamble, we'd been taught about instrument flying. Bob Knights would take us up in a VC-10 on our second ever flight and give us our instrument rating test on our second ever flight on VC-10, a big jet, which we all passed. And his philosophy was, well, that's your skill, you've all got that. We'll get that out of the way, we'll concentrate on the real stuff. And Jeff was just really characterful. I remember once with him, and we'd been out doing some air work, coming back off the southern coast of Ireland, based at Shannon. Coming back in, and I was in the right-hand seat, and he said, it was a lovely day, Mike. He said, let's go do a bit of sightseeing. I said, oh, okay. So let down to 1,000 feet, he says. So I go down to 1,000 feet. And then just in the mist in the distance, I can just see the southwest coast of Ireland. We're out over the sea. And I realized where we are. We're pointing directly for things called the Cliffs of Moher. Don't know whether you know that part of the world. That's 650 feet high, practically sheer vertical cliffs. And I thought, he's going to fly low over the top of those. Ah, great. Go down to 500 feet, he says. Oh, all right then, I'll go down 500 feet. Go down to 200 feet, he says. I think, is he going to take control? So I said, right, okay, at 200 feet, we're doing about 420 miles an hour, pointing straight at these cliffs. And you know at some point he's going to say, I have control, and just pull up over them. He's not doing it. He's letting me carry on. And I could see them. And of course, in your mind's eye, they're as close as the wall at the back of the room. What's going to happen? At the very last moment, he said, right, I have control. Pulled back, put all the power, and climbed up just over the top of the cliffs. Unfortunately, just to the left of where we were, there's a pub with a little hotel and rooms and things. And this is his party trick. He's been doing this for a long time. And eventually, this Irish publican had had enough. And so he made a formal complaint to BOAC about this idiot guy who kept beating up his pub. You know, and you can imagine, it's destroying my customer, they won't come back. Anyway, so Jeff gets hauled in the office, gets a real dressing down, but like a true Second World War pilot, he takes no notice of that. And so the next day, up again, I'm sort of in the right-hand seat again. He said, I got real dressing down for doing that. Oh, yeah, he said, shall we go and do it again then? So this time, same thing, he takes control, full power, up. But as soon as we got over the top of the cliff, he put 45 degrees of bank on, right over the top of the hotel. It subsequently transpired that he broke 3 windows, 18 tiles came off. We know this because the landlord of the hotel rang up that evening and said, all right, you win, the drinks are on me. So.
Well, I know after several very enjoyable years flying the VC-10, then it was on to Concorde. Before that, when did Concorde first enter your sort of consciousness? When did it first become a plane that you set your sights on?
I guess, having been this boy of 7 who wanted to be a pilot, I was aware of the development. I was aware that Britain and France signed up in 1962. I got a copy of Flight every week and Aeroplane, and I carried on and kept abreast of it. It was just something I wanted to do. And I can remember watching the very first flight of the British assembled Concorde, April the 9th, 1969. Black and white television in the corner of a study room with Raymond Baxter commentating on it. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to fly Concorde. So that was it. I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, obviously good enough looking to get through the scope. And you put your name down, and if you were in the right place, the right seniority, and considered to be technically suitable, whatever that might mean, then your name went in the hat, and they were drawn out in seniority order.
So, and what was the routine from there? How did you, I mean, it must have been a very different kind of aeroplane. How did you graduate from an aeroplane like the VC-10?
Well, any conversion course between two airplanes in an airline is around 2 months long. So if you're converting from, say, an Airbus A320 onto a Boeing 777, it'll be about 2 months long, because you've got to learn, how the airplane works, how to fly it, how to handle it in emergencies, how to operate it, and how to operate it commercially to make sure you're getting the best result. And of course, over all of that is the safety. The Concorde course is 6 months long, because there's just so much of it. So it's 2 months chalk and talk in the classroom, 2 months flying the simulator, and those 4 months are residential in Bristol, so you're away from your family for 4 months, apart from Friday night and Saturday night, and Friday night you're just recovering, and Saturday you're probably studying, then back down to Bristol, and then the last 2 months flying the line with a training pilot and learning how to operate the aircraft. And there is so much more, and of course it's a whole new regime. You know, it was for the airplane, nobody had ever done this before, and for the crews it is, because none of us had ever done it before. And the simulator, which we have at Brooklands now, where if you wanted to, you could come along and fly it with me or one of my colleagues. The simulator is very realistic, and it's sat on a motion platform, and it could simulate G, but only to a certain extent. It couldn't simulate a sustained G. And so when you did your very first flight on the airplane itself, in my case at Bryce Norton, the captain would say something to you like, right, Mike, I want you to put full power on, climb straight ahead to 2,500 feet and level off, if you can. You think, what do you mean if I can? You know, I'm an experienced pilot, of course I can. Sit on the end of the runway, 3, 2, 1 now, bang, the throttle's open, and you are literally pushed back into your seat, etc. Because you're using full power and reheat, the same power you'd use if the airplane weighed 185 tons. We only weighed 120 tons. So it goes like a rocket. That actually was the nickname that the crews gave the airplane, the rocket. And the next thing I knew, I'm at 4,000 feet, and I don't know what the heck's happened. I look across to the captain next to me, who's got this big smile on his face, laughing his head off. And he said, don't worry, he said, we all do it. And subsequently, when I became a training captain, I used to inflict the same punishment on my trainees. You know, it's nothing like revenge is a dish best served cold. And they all did it. And, you know, it's just one of those really powerful memories of my Concorde career.
Well, the book opens, of course, with a prologue, and the prologue is the terrible crash, obviously, that happened in July 2000. What you do, of course, is, and you're not always conscious of this as the reader, is you're dropping clues in all the time. You know, pay attention to this part of the book, because you're going to need to know how it fits into the Concorde crash story later. We ought to talk a little bit about Concorde's remarkable engineering traits, you know, some of the phenomenal innovations in her. For instance, like, you know, how to trim the aircraft for supersonic flight. That was very innovative, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, there's loads of gee-whiz stuff that we used to, it's all true, we used to use it for the marketing, the edge of space, where the sky got darker, where you could see the curvature of the Earth. You're traveling 1,350 miles an hour, 23 miles a minute, a mile every 2 3/4 seconds. You're going so quickly that you're going faster than the Earth rotates. So if you took off in London at 7 p.m. in the autumn or the spring, you'd fly west so quickly the sun would rise in the west. You'd land in New York in broad daylight, and then you'd see the second sunset of the day as you went into Manhattan. You could stand a pound coin on its edge on the table in the cabin in front of the customers, and it wouldn't topple over when you're doing Mach 2, 23 miles a minute, in a 30-degree bank turn. So all of that is absolutely astounding. And the engineering challenges that faced the engineers in those days were phenomenal. And the kernel of the project is the late 50s, early 60s. And it still amazes me that the British and the French engineers succeeded in solving all of these problems. And in fact, that's one of the reasons it was a joint project between Britain and France, because there's only really one perfect solution to a real complex problem like that. And independently, the British and French had come up with pretty much the same solution. Their two airplanes were very similar, and that's how they merged into Concorde. And when you think the last flight of Concorde was 20 years ago this year, And nobody else has done it since. There are some people on the threshold of doing it, but nobody's done it since then, and yet Concorde was designed and produced in the 60s. You know, an absolutely astounding piece of technical engineering.
Well, we ought to move on to not just what it was like up front, but also for passengers. You must have had some quite memorable customers on the aircraft, I imagine, didn't you?
One of the things we offer in British Airways is discretion. So I trust if I tell you anything, you never mention this to anyone else. No. Yeah, it was great. And because in the early days, prior to 9/11, we would leave the flight deck door open. The passengers would ask if they could come up to the flight deck, and if they're really regular, they wouldn't even ask, they'd just come. And our customers, 80% of our customers were business people, and 80% of those were repeat customers. So you got to know the customer. You were in first name terms with a lot of them. And they would recognize you, you'd recognize them, you'd see them repeatedly, and you'd meet some fascinating people. Clearly the captains of industry, particularly because 80% of people were business people, but of the other 20%, 10% were the rich and famous, 5% were sports and TV, and the other 5% were people just taking the trip of a lifetime. And I met, one of the great people I met, I'm a keen golfer, it was Tom Watson. An absolutely delightful guy, and he just won the Open in the mid-80s, and he and a bunch of other US professional golfers were flying back to the States on a chartered Concorde, and he came up to the flight deck with the Open trophy and sat on the flight deck chatting to us for a while, and then the stewardess came up and said, Mr. Watson, your lunch is ready. So he said, I'll go back. I'll tell you what, guys, I'll leave it here with you so you can have some photographs taken. So off he goes, leaving the Open trophy sitting there on the center console. Out come the cameras, snap, snap, snap. We're in heaven until I drop the wretched thing right on the top of the center console, which is very solid, and there is a significant dent in it. So back he comes for further chat so we turned it round so the dent's at the opposite side of where he's sitting, and handed it back to him, and off he went, and it was great. Next year, he was also on the flight, and the following year, he'd come number 2 in the Open. I don't know if the golf aficionados remember this, and he was leading right up until the 17th hole on the last round, when he pushed his ball through the back of the green, took a couple of chip back on, and lost by a stroke. And so he comes, got a message, Mr. Watson sends his regards, Mike, can he come up and see you? Now, I'm Mike, I'm the co-pilot, the boss is sitting in the left-hand seat, who was clearly ticked off that Tom Watson knew me by name and wanted to come and see me. Didn't ask the captain's permission, but hey-ho. So up comes Tom Watson. Hi, Mike, lovely to see you again. And the highlight of my career is when Tom Watson said, last year I forgot to get your autograph. He said, I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah, he said, you signed the certificate for everybody else, but not for me. Will you sign my supersonic certificate? So I did. And he still hadn't seen the dent that was still there 15 years later.
And Her Majesty the Queen,
I absolutely,
see.
Yeah.
Yep.
She and the members of the royal family, senior members of the royal family, all flew on Concorde. I never had the privilege to fly Her Majesty the Queen, but I did fly Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon once. And they were coming back from Bahrain, where they'd been on a state visit. And we'd flown out to Bahrain. The routine was we'd fly out to Bahrain, night stop in Bahrain, and fly the same airplane back the next day. And the way we do it in the airlines is the captain will fly one way and the co-pilot the other. And on this occasion, the captain, who should remain nameless, but it was Hector McMullen, he decided to fly the airplane out, and I was going to fly it back. That's standard practice. So we get to the airport in Bahrain, and the airport manager comes over to Hector, whispers in his ear, and they disappear off into a corner. We don't know what's going on. Get on board, start doing our checks, and then about 10 minutes before departure, he asked the engineer to close the flight deck door, and he said, chaps, he said, I know you saw me talking to the station manager here. I'm now allowed to tell you that Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon are coming back with us after this state visit. Okay, so because that's the case, I think I should fly the airplane back. Now, this was going to be my sector, so I took it like a man and sulked. Gear up, do it yourself. Anyway, so the thing we would always do is invite particularly important people and royalty. Would you like to sit on the flight deck for takeoff or landing? And they almost always said no. But Her Royal Highness decided, yes, she'd love to. So as we're coming into Heathrow, back goes the invitation. back comes the reply, she would love to. So Her Royal Highness came up and we pop her into the supernumerary seat. And at Heathrow, we're landing towards the east. So you come over Ockham radio beacon near Wisley, go off to the west, swing round, come back again. I'm still sulking because I'm not flying the airplane, but I think the best thing really is to explain to Her Royal Highness where everything is. So we come off Ockham and we're going along at 6,000 feet, and I say that, there, Your Royal Highness, if you look out the window now, you can see Ascot. And she says, oh, that's very interesting. Swing round onto base leg, 4,000 feet. If you look out of the window now, Your Royal Highness, you can see Bracknell. Whoever wants to know where Bracknell is? If you live in Bracknell, I'm sorry, I mean it. And then swing out to finals, and of course, it brings you in over Windsor Castle. And so she looks out of the window, and the Royal Standard, which is massive, is flying. She says, oh, I see my sister's home. Anyway, I'm still sulking. You know, he says, gear down, do it yourself. Anyway, so we're coming in, and Hector's flying the airplane, and he gets the last bit wrong. That's the thing about being a pilot. You can fly an airplane from London to Singapore perfectly, but if you do the last bit wrong and the last foot and you smack it into the runway, everybody thinks it's an awful sector. Well, Hector did it in trumps, and he really slammed the airplane in, and we bounced. And as we were rolling down the runway, this voice came on the intercom on the flight deck with her, Princess Margaret saying, that's his knighthood gone, isn't it? Yes! Unbearable in victory, snivelling in defeat.
Well, there must have been many memorable moments. And I know, sticking to the royal theme, that 2002, the Jubilee, was a highlight. Can you tell us a little bit about that very special day?
We were approached for the Queen's Golden Jubilee to join the flypast, and that was magical. Being an airline, we don't do that sort of stuff. We used to in the 80s, but the board put a stop to it. And so it's not just a rock up on the day deal. There was 6 months of meticulous planning that went into this beforehand, including me flying with the red arrows on a full display, sitting behind the leader, then coming down to Bristol, flying the simulator, all of this stuff. And eventually it results in a practice day for real. So the formation is made up of lots of elements, and we, with the red arrows, are the last ones. The brief from the Air Chief Marshal that briefed us was, you don't have to worry about the navigation chaps. Our brand new C5 at the front, that'll do all of, not C5, Starlifter, C-17, will do all the navigation. All you've got to do is just follow the one in front. Any question? Okay, all right then. What happens if the one in front is off? Well, just follow him, don't worry. Oh, okay, yeah. So anyway, we line up with the red arrows, and we're over the North Sea, and then to our south is the rest of the formation over the North Sea. They're all forming up. We're stuffed with the reds. And we're joining up over the lighthouse at Southwold in Suffolk. It just so happens that the lighthouse at the Southwold in Suffolk is on the extended centreline of the Mall, and it's always used for flypasts in Buckingham Palace. So if there's a formation at Buckingham Palace any time and you want a really good view, go to Southwold, because they come right over the top. Anyway, so we come in and we're there getting into position, and the element in front of us is a brand new Typhoon. It's not been delivered to the RAF yet. It is still in testing stage. It's being driven by a BA Systems test pilot, and it's not there. So we got a message saying, it's unserviceable on the ground. We're putting a Tornado in its place. Okay, no problem. So there's a Tornado in front of us. We fly in, cross over Southwold, and then we swing north to go up to Barham, because we don't go over London for the practice. And that all went very well. On the day, same thing. We're over the North Sea, the rest of the formation out to the left-hand side. We come into where it's no Typhoon. It's not there. It's supposed to be there this time, but not there. And I'm chatting to the co-pilot and say, well, I don't know what I'm going to do now. It might just close up the gap. And then just as we're about to make this decision, there's the Typhoon off to the right, accompanied by 2 tornadoes. And what had happened, we found out, was that the most sophisticated airplane that the RAF would ever have, had got lost. Its nav system had packed up, and the guy was struggling with it. So anyway, they usher the Typhoon into position between us and the preceding element, which was a Domini. Over the coast, down, and as we get to the Hackney Marshes, the 2 Typhoons disappear, because they're not in the flypast at that stage, or tornadoes rather. The 2 tornadoes disappear, leaving the Typhoon ahead of us, and he starts to drift off to the right. And by the time we come over Buckingham Palace, He's up over Chorley Wood or something. He's a mile and a half off to the right, which is why you never saw the typhoon in the TV pictures. And as we came down the Mall, it's one of the most sensational moments of my life. Looking out of the window and seeing 1.5 million people on the ground, all over the Mall, all over the parks, all over the bridges, and waving and cheering. We were doing 325 miles an hour at just 1,000 feet in close formation with 9 red arrows. And it was sensational. It was really, really wonderful. And fortunately, because of that, I was subsequently invited to a Buckingham Palace party that Her Majesty threw for all the people that had been involved in the Golden Jubilee celebrations, and had the honour to chat to Her Majesty for about 5 minutes, or it seemed like it, and also to Prince Philip. And talking to Prince Philip, he said, "Oh, yeah, you're that Concorde chappie, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." "We did enjoy your flying over Buckingham Palace," he said, "but normally when we're at Windsor, you're bloody noisy. Can you cut it out?" So, yeah, well, of course we can, sir. Yeah, so well, that was sensational.
Brilliant. Well, we've jumped ahead a little bit, of course, because 2 years prior to that was the accident. Do you, I mean, probably a lot of people here, I should think, would remember where they were when they heard that news. Where were you, Mike?
Well, I and my wife, Chris, and our daughter, Amy, were going up the gangplank of the QE2. I was on holiday, and we were going to New York, cross on the QE2, a few days at New York, and then fly back. And my pager and my phone went off at the same time. Ring British Airways, most urgent. So I did. And that's when I first heard of the terrible accident in Paris. If you'd asked me in advance how I'd react if there was a Concorde crash, I think I'd have probably said something like, "It can't happen, the airplane's phenomenally safe, and if it did, it would be awful for the aviation project, awful for the supersonic concept, awful for airlines in general." But it wasn't like that at all. It was all about the people. And my first reaction was to ring my counterpart in Air France, who had just arrived at the crash scene, and talk to him about what had happened. Then the next decision is, what do I do? Do I go on holiday, or do I go back to BA's emergency centre at Heathrow? So the bags come out of the cabin, and we get the car back up, and I'm on a conference call all the way back up to Heathrow. We live near Heathrow. So I dropped Amy and Chris off at home. Amy is 6, and go into the emergency centre and spend the next 24 hours working on what had really happened. And in hindsight, we knew overnight, the first night, 97% of what had happened, so we felt confident to let our flight the next day go, which we did. And then after it had gone, I went back home and to face a 6-year-old daughter who'd been really, really looking forward to this trip. A friend of ours runs Sesame Street, and there was a fancy dress party going to be on. So Amy had got all her fancy dress kit in. She was going as Buzz Lightyear in her suitcase. Really upset. But fortunately, Chris had let her see the TV coverage, so she knew what had happened. And I said to her, "You know where Daddy's been, don't you?" And she said, "Yes, Daddy, you've been making sure this will never happen again." And that's what we focused on. And that's what all air accident investigation focuses on. Finding out what happened to stop it happening again. Unfortunately, and I cover this in the book, in France it ain't like that. Most places in the rest of the world, if there's an accident, the lead authority in the investigation is the Air Accident Investigation Agency of the country where the accident takes place. They'll be supported by others, engine manufacturers, airframe manufacturers, usually the NTSB if there's American contact. But the lead agency is the Accident Investigation Organization, not in France. In France, the lead agency is the prefect of where the accident took place. So the equivalent of that would be if an accident took place at Heathrow, the lead person would be the senior JP at Bracknell or Kingston. They had no aviation experience whatsoever. Their objective is to find out if anybody is criminally liable. If they are, to prosecute them to the point of taking them to trial. And because they're the prime agency, they take precedent over everybody else. So when it came to looking at evidence, physical evidence, a lot of it we never got to see because the prefect would confiscate it. And we were doing what you do in air accident investigations. rebuilding the wreckage into as much of an aeroplane as we could to try and find out more about what happened. If we found anything interesting, the gendarmes who were there guarding us, because it's under the auspices of the prefect, would talk to each other and come over and just take this, this piece of evidence away. We never saw it again. We reckoned that the prefect had it all underneath his bed. So eventually we found a system where we would indicate to each other we'd found something, and then we'd talk about it that night in the hotel, not in the hangar. And that worked for a while. I mean, it was that mechanism that led us to discover that the undercarriage would have been replaced and had missed out a very serious part of being left out of it, and we saw that it had. But even that disappeared after 2 or 3 days. And it really was difficult, because the objective of the prefect to find out what happened and to prosecute somebody, and that's what went ahead. So it was a criminal charge, a criminal court. There were 5 people being prosecuted. There were 2 employees of the US airline Continental. The metal strip that damaged the tire came from the back of a Continental DC-10's thrust reverser. So the 2 technicians that were involved in that, the person that physically fitted it and his supervisor for signing it off, and the 3 people in the French organization who were responsible for the design, manufacture, and certification of the airplane. There was a trial. Guess what? The 3 French were found not guilty, and the 2 Americans were found guilty. One of the Americans was sentenced to 15 months in prison with a massive fine. And then there was an appeal process. And we went through the appeal process and brought up some interesting new evidence, and all of the guilty verdicts were overturned. But sadly, a buddy of mine who, Henri Perrier, passed away in the intervening time. So it was a very difficult time when all we really wanted to do was to make sure we found out what had happened to stop it happening again, and to devise the modifications to get the airplane back into service, which we did, and she went back into service very successfully for just over 2 years before we had to retire the airplane because Air France wanted to pull out.
And I do think that's a remarkable thing about the book is, as I said at the beginning, you read it, it's part memoir, it's part, testimony to this phenomenal piece of engineering. But you journey with the aircraft as ultimately British Airways Chief Concorde Pilot. And juggling all of those jobs and hats must have been hard. I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like having to oversee the investigation process or be a part of the investigation process, and at the same time get the aircraft back into service. I mean, that must have been a lot of stress, wasn't it?
It was pretty stressful, but I had to split myself professionally, because getting the airplane back into service, half of me, was very emotional and very passionate, and this is something we've got to really drive and do. But the air accident investigation part, you've got to be methodical, you've got to be dispassionate, and if you find outcomes that aren't good, you've got to accept them. You can't put them to one side because of your other objective to get the airplane flying. So it was difficult, but they all came together eventually, because we did find out what caused the accident, we did find the right modifications, we did implement them, and we did get the airplane back into service. So that was a very rewarding period of time for me and all my colleagues at BA.
So obviously you retired, as you said, at 55, and I don't want to cast aspersions, Mike, but that was a little while ago. What have you been doing? What have you been doing since then?
Yeah, it was a little while ago. This 7-year-old boy that wanted to be a pilot, my dreams were realised in trumps, and so I come from a background where if you've been lucky enough to do all that stuff, you've got to put something back, and that's what drives me now. Hence my voluntary work, hence my charitable work, and I find that extremely rewarding, particularly when it involves young people. So I'm the president of an Air Cadet Squadron, chair of governors of an independent school, so all that stuff associated with young people, and vice chair at Brooklands Museum. It's great to hopefully try and inspire people, young people, to grab hold of something and have the passion for it that I did for aviation. It doesn't matter whether that passion is for aviation, that's a secondary thing for them. But there's nothing that can beat seeing a young person and finding the lights turned on in their mind about what they want to do, how they want to do it, and how they're going to get there. That's extremely rewarding.
And you write very emotively about not just about the final passenger, airline passenger flight of Concorde, but also it was a sort of rather drawn-out retirement process of Concorde herself, getting her to all of those museums. I mean, which of the very last flights do you remember most?
Yeah, we at British Airways, we were absolutely determined that we're not going to take a step back. Having had to face up to the fact that we were going to retire the airplane, I fought vehemently against that decision. But unfortunately, my argument didn't carry the day at the top of BA. And then you're faced with a choice, aren't you? Do you throw your toys out of the pram, or do you accept collective responsibility and just get on with the job? So I chose answer B and was put in charge of the retirement program. And I and those I was working with were determined that we'd retire the airplane with style as a tribute to the 27 years of supersonic service. It was going to be a celebration and not a wake. We've got to be mindful of the accident, of course we have, but we want to make sure that we celebrate the thousands upon thousands of people that are involved. So as pilots and flight crew and cabin crew, yeah, we're at the sharp end of this project. But 50,000 people were employed in the UK alone to build it, the designers, the operators, the people that loaded the bags, the ticket agent. All of these people came together to make this magical airplane a truth and to make this magical airplane do what it did. So we had to celebrate all that they had done. And then we've got to think about where are we going to put the airplanes, because we're not going to break them up. They've got to go to very deserving stewards for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So we advertised, and initially we had about 850 applications to take a BA Concorde. We cut that down to 80 really serious applications, and then on the best committee I've ever sat on, we decided where they were going. And that was the best. It was the best committee because there was only two of us, me and the guy that took the notes. Great. And we decided where we were going to allocate the airplanes, and then the next plan was to actually get them there and make as big of a song and a dance out of it as we possibly could. So that's what we did, and I was involved in, because by that stage I'd stood down all of my pilots and flight engineers and just retained two of my managers, two manager pilots and two management engineers, flight engineers, and we took the airplanes off to their final resting places.
And all of that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago this year.
Will we see her like again?
I think we will. I'm an optimist. My glass is always half full. I don't think the human race takes backward steps for very long. Amy, our daughter, who was 6, is now 29. She's a 737 pilot and instructor for TUI, and her aspiration is to fly a supersonic airliner, and I think she will. There's been a number of companies who've tried a supersonic project. The one that at the moment looks the most promising in my eyes is Boom Aerospace in Denver in Colorado with a beast called the Overture, which I think you might be able to see from the photograph behind me looks very similar to Concorde. And when I pointed that out to the chief designer at Boom, he just said, yeah, well, you Brits got it right first time. And that will be a Mach 1.7 airliner, slightly slower than Concorde, slightly smaller. It'll carry 55 passengers in the first iteration, and if it's successful, they'll stretch it to 70. Use sustainable aviation fuel, much longer range, and the proposition, and all the environmental rules that are applicable when it comes to service. And the proposition will be, this is a 3-class airplane, so tourist, business first. Concorde wasn't. Concorde was one class, first class plus all the way through. This will be a 3-class airplane. Would you pay, personally, would you pay 20% more to get there in half the time? So if the ticket you're thinking of buying is 500 quid, would you pay 20% more and pay 600 quid to get there in half the time? And I think that that proposition is very attractive and will be for many people. So I'm optimistic. The airplane is due to start manufacture in 2025. The factory is being assembled right now. And the proof of concept airplane, the XB-1, is scheduled to fly this year. So maybe Amy will get her aspiration and Dad will be pleased as punch if they ever offer me a trip in it.
Well, we're going to take questions at the end. For the moment, Mike, thank you very much. If the technology works here, we should be able to treat ourselves to a short film celebrating Concorde.
It's just a magnificent looking aeroplane, and I just saw it just flying over our house, and I thought, wow. And every time it went over, I would run out and I would stand there until I couldn't see it anymore, and that's how it went on.
The enthusiasm never wanes. It's almost like every flight's your first flight. You know, you still get that cheesy grin on your face on takeoff, and it stays there till we touch down in New York.
As soon as you get close to it, you're just in awe at the shape of it. It's just a beautiful machine to look at.
There's sort of an area expectancy before the aircraft sort of pushes back and starts its takeoff roll, and that is very exciting when they put the afterburners on and you get the push in the back. It's fabulous.
Speedbird Concorde 1, you're clear for takeoff. 27 left, surface wind 240 at 10.
Speedbird Concorde 1, roger, clear for takeoff, 27 left. Everybody ready? Yeah. 3, 2, 1, now.
Slam the throttles forward, the power starts to bite. Push back into your seat.
Airspeed's building.
Concentrating like mad.
60 knots.
The noise takes over.
100 knots. That's it.
All the calls come out from the engineer. The heart starts to pound a bit.
B1. Rotate. B2. Positive climb.
Before you know it, you're airborne. Just holding her back, you can feel she just wants to go.
It's just the most staggering experience. Everyone says it's going to be something you'll never forget for the rest of your life.
You can always recognise it, and it's almost, I know it sounds silly, but it looks like a swan. You know, when swans fly, it looks like a swan with the shape of its neck.
The outside is so elegant and causes gasps of amazement even after all this time. Every time somebody, oh, there's Concorde, there's Concorde.
You kind of think, oh, I wonder who might be on Concorde, maybe a famous film star who's just signed a contract in New York or something.
I can't remember exactly how many times I flew Concorde, year 2000, but it must have been maybe 30 times, and that's, 30 nights that you're not away from your kids.
As I looked out of the window, I could see the shadow of night falling across the planet, and we flew into this line. And, you don't get that anywhere other than in a spacecraft.
The most wonderful thing about Concorde is that no matter how many times you fly and you think you become a jaded flyer, there still is that amazing, exciting sensation when you take off and when you're up in the air. You look out the window and you can't believe the speed at which you're traveling and the vista of the globe. It's really spectacular.
She's just a beautiful bird in the sky, and that is just where she belongs.
Well, I was going to say, as you might imagine, I've seen that video a few times. Whoa. I've seen that video a few times. It still makes the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. This airplane was wonderful, technical achievement beyond anything else, really, that aviation's thrown at us. Yet, despite all the gee whiz stuff, faster than a rifle bullet, expanding 8 to 10 inches in flight because of heating, crossed the Atlantic in 2 hours and 52 minutes. It wasn't just the mechanics of it, it was the people. It's a fabulous airplane, could do really wonderful things, but it was the people that made Concorde special. The 50,000 people in the UK alone that built her, the designers, the engineers, the loaders, the baggage loaders, the ticket agents, the flight crew, the cabin crew, the people in the UK who funded through their taxes the design and development of the airplane, and consequently all felt that they owned it, which was great, and would look up every time Concorde flew over. And the 2.5 million people who flew Concorde in British Airways, and you, because it's now 20 years since Concorde last graced the sky, and yet I am so thrilled to see so many of you here who are still interested in Concorde and this wonderful airplane that we, the Brits and the French, produced together, that can tell so many stories and such a big part of my life. And I really, really thank you for being interested enough to join us tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. For now, we conclude the formal session. We do have time for a few questions. But Mike, thank you. That was a wonderful talk.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
So if you have any questions, if you'd like to go to the microphone over there, if anybody has any at all. Lady over there.
My first question, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. My first question is, Mike, do you remember the first individual Concorde that you flew on that first flight, which one it was?
Yep, I do. I've written about it all in the book, and another plug for the book. I mean, it's pitiful, really, but yeah, and I found them all the same. Some of my colleagues thought they could tell the difference between a different airplane and the BA fleet. BA had 7 Concordes. Some reckon they could tell the difference between one and another. I couldn't. I'm not that clever. They all felt exactly the same to me, but I remember it like it was yesterday, but sadly it wasn't.
Yeah. Do you remember what the registration was?
Yep.
Okay. So you have to read the book to find out. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, next question. We got somebody else?
Yeah.
Was there any one person who had the initial idea to build a plane of roughly that shape to fly at twice the speed of sound and twice the height of other normal aircraft?
I don't really think there was one person. All these things are the collective effort of a huge number of people and a huge number of brains. George Edwards was on the British side, was the one person that kind of drew a huge amount of it together. And he, interestingly, there's a lovely anecdotal story, which I happen to believe is true. When they were doing some test flying in the early days prior to entry into service, they got 100 real people and they loaded them on board as passengers for a test flight, and they were mimicking up what it would be like in airline service. And one of the individuals invited on this test flight was an 85-year-old lady who had never flown before. I don't mean piloted, she'd never been on an airplane before. At the end of the flight, he deliberately went up to her and asked her what she thought of the flight. And she said, well, it was okay, but I was really quite disappointed. He thought, what? You know, you've just traveled at 1,350 miles an hour. You've been halfway to New York and back in 3 hours and 20 minutes. You're disappointed. Tell me, madam, he said, why is that? So she said, well, when we went through the sound barrier, it didn't all shake and rattle. In preparation for a trip, she'd watched that black and white movie called The Sound Barrier, you know, where they went, So he looked her straight in the eyes and said, madam, that's the clever bit. So, yeah, he was instrumental. Barnes Wallis, of course, before him, was doing a lot of research work on supersonic passenger aircraft. So it's a collective of many, many, many pieces that came together and many individuals who are involved.
Another gentleman there? Well, you can line up after each other if you want.
Yeah, form an orderly queue.
Queue up.
Not too many.
I flew Concorde on an excursion flight to Västerås, which is a small airport in Sweden. I was rather surprised that Concorde could actually get into the airport. But anyway, when we arrived, the captain announced that the tower had requested a flyby. And I mean, I was obviously on the air, I couldn't tell what was going on, although I was by a window. And then suddenly, to my enormous surprise, the aircraft went into a very steep bank. And one of the strongest memories I have of that flight is looking out of the window and seeing trees and bushes whizzing past just a few 100 feet below the aircraft before it leveled out and landed. I just want to ask you something about the low-speed handling of Concorde.
It's a fair cop. That was me at Västerås. You may not have seen it, but at the time we were in formation with the Flying Fortress, which they'd put up. And in advance of that flight, we knew that this was going to be proposed when we got there, that we did a low fly past and did some formation flying with the Flying Fortress. And we as a crew decided it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So we didn't ask for permission. We did do it, and we got a real rollicking afterwards, but that was huge fun. The airplane is very, very stable at high speed and slow speed. I was also the chief test pilot for BA, so I'd take the airplane up on test flights where we go way outside the normal flight envelope. So the fastest I've ever flown a Concorde was a Mach 2.04, and I had 1,475 knots on the clock because we had a tailwind. And the slowest I've flown, it was 110 knots, way below the normal approach speed. And that's because the wing is aerodynamically different. So it doesn't stall, the wing does not stall, it generates vortex lift at slow speeds. So the issue is the fact that as you get more and more nose up, you'll get more and more lift, but the rate of increase of lift is lower than the rate of increase of drag. So although the wing is still flying, you will descend because you're getting increasing amounts of drag. But it was fully controllable, you know, between 110 knots and 1,475. Didn't they do well? Thank you.
I must say, it occurred to me in response to an earlier question about people who came up with the idea of Concorde and the shape. I think that's almost every schoolboy who ever created a paper aeroplane. Little did we know at that time. My question is this. Do you think that pilot error played any part in the Air France crash? And I ask because a mutual friend of ours does take the view that there was pilot error. What is your view, having been involved in the investigation?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
Do you think, what part, if any, do you think pilot error played in the crash? And I mentioned somebody known to us both takes the view there was some pilot error. What is your view, having been part of the investigation?
Yeah. All accidents are a chain of events. So even if it's a simple accident, like let's say tomorrow, I hope you don't, but let's say tomorrow you fall over in the shower in the morning. It's a very simple accident. It could be quite painful, but it's a very simple accident. There's a chain of events, maybe 3 elements in the chain. The water's running, you drop the soap, and you don't look where you put your foot, so you fall over. If you take away any one of the links in that chain, if the water's not running, or you don't drop the soap, or you do look where you put your foot, the accident doesn't happen. All accidents are like that. It's the metaphorical thing about the cheeses and all the holes lining up. So there are certain things about the way that the aircraft was operated by the crew on that day, which I had to face up to, because as a technical part of what I did as well was to be seconded to the AIB as an investigator and a lead technical investigator. And then during the trial, I was a technical expert for the defense, and I was a witness. And I was faced with a conundrum, because it's kind of an unwritten rule that you don't criticize your fellow crew members, especially if sadly they're dead and not able to answer for themselves. And I really didn't want to break that unwritten rule. So when I was talking to the lawyers, I said right at the very beginning, look, I'm not going to criticize the crew in open court. I'm just not going to do that. Anyway, as things went on, I thought, well, you know, there are so many things in this accident that we really should be focusing on, about how things were rushed, about how things were done incorrectly, about decisions that were made. I can't ignore that. It's a reality. So the hat I put on was the one of a Czech pilot instructor, which I'd been for 20 years. How would I have marked that crew and assessed them if they had performed like that on a Czech flight? And I thought, that's the way to do it. I will go at it like that. And I will just dispassionately look at their performance, and I will praise it, criticize it, or make suggestions, as I would do day in and day out in the simulator. And that's what I've done in the book, because, yes, you're absolutely right, Tudor, there are a number of things that, shall we say, lead to questions about the way that the crew performed, and in fact the way the whole organisation in Air France performed. And the way I address that, which is given in lots of detail in the book, is as of a Czech pilot looking on at what had happened.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, time for 2 more questions.
Great talk, Mike.
Thank you.
I've got a geeky question now. I used to be a flight test engineer on the MRCA, the Tornado, and during those early test flights, they used the attitude indicator, the angle of attack indicator. I know you had one on Concorde, but did you use it much?
It was one of the key instruments on the flight deck. Yeah, very much so. It was so rigged that if you're flying level at a particular speed, you would soon learn what the right pitch attitude is to fly level at that speed. But it was so rigged, so say you're descending at a constant speed from 15,000 feet down to 5,000 feet. Doesn't matter the rate of descent as long as your airspeed's constant. All you had to do was look at your angle of attack indicator, and you knew that would be the attitude you had to fly level when you got to your cleared altitude. So we're constantly using it, very, very much so, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Great talk, Mike. The accountability for where the Concordes went, you take. And so you're not allowed to nominate Delta Golf because you've got a very special interest in Brooklands. But which of the Concordes that have found a home do you feel is being best looked after?
They're all slightly different, and the presentation to the members of the public is different. You can do different things at different locations. The ones I favour clearly are the ones that have been fortunate enough and had the ability to put the aircraft under cover, because I think that's really important. Sadly, we haven't done that yet at Brooklands, but it's on our to-do list. But of the others that are undercover, the one in Filton is very good. I like the way that it's portrayed, and they project part of the story on the side of the airplane, which is an innovative way of doing it. Having said it's innovative, they were doing it in Barbados too before that exhibition closed down temporarily. So they're complementary to each other. So, and that's quite intentional. They all tell the same story with a slightly different element being emphasized. So for instance, the Brooklands one, we do something that nobody else does, which is we have a virtual flight in the forward cabin, as if you were really on the airplane, as if you really were going on a Concorde flight. And what we've done to make it more realistic is put seat simulation underneath each seat. So the seats vibrate in accordance with what you're doing in the aircraft. So we've done that. And we've had more, on a good day, we'll get 400 people through that aircraft. And in the 11 years from getting the airplane in service in 2006 to 2017, we had more people take that virtual flight in the one aircraft than ever flew on any British Airways Concorde in real service. So, yeah, I'm very proud of that, but they're all very different. And I would suggest it's worth visiting every single one of them.
Mike and Nick, thank you very much for a very entertaining evening. I know everybody here, the Aeronautical Society and Heritage Group are very appreciative of you coming along to see us. And you touched on it earlier, you're very right. Anybody who had worked with Concorde anyway on a day-to-day basis, I first validated as a young lad on the West Country sectors, air traffic control at West Drayton. And we had completely separate procedures for dealing with Concorde. You had your own route, special procedures. And we had a big checklist as well before you even push back. And my story I always remember was there was a particular danger area in the West Country. We had to phone up, Army danger area. And we had to phone them up and say, look, Concorde's coming in about 20 minutes. Whatever you're doing, stop it. And we just should say, stop it. And one day I said to them, I never knew what they did. And I said, by the way, what are you doing today? And bear in mind, might be going over about 24,000 feet or something at that stage. He said, we're throwing hand grenades. And I said, well, you're very unlikely to actually hit it, but it says on my bit of paper you better stop to stop, you know. So no, we've had a great evening. And it's interesting, you go to somewhere like Filton or Brooklands, and what's interesting, in 20 years, there's a couple of generations there who've actually never seen Concorde flying now. But through your book, I hope they get to read it, because it brings it alive. It was what it was like for all of us to experience the Concorde and working with it. So, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
And before you go, two more heritage events for this year. We've just had actually the TSR2 conference at Cosford, which went very well. And then next week, Paul Beaver, those of you who know Paul, Paul's written a book about Eric Winkle-Brown, who some of us knew. And basically it's all the stuff, those who knew Eric, he wrote a book called Wings on My Sleeve, which was probably one of the best aviation books you could read. Well, there were certain things Eric wasn't allowed to write at the time when he wrote it. So Paul has got all Eric's log books. Before Eric died, he was working with Paul on the latest book. So Paul's doing a book release next week. He's already got 75 people coming on the 8th of June. If you want to come here and see his presentation, if you leave me your details, I'll see if Paul can fit you in. So that's on the 8th. And then the Heritage Group's next lecture will be by an author, Paul Crickmore, who, funnily enough, used to work with me. and it's about Mach 3 reconnaissance, not of the SR-71, but the aircraft that preceded it, the Lockheed A-12, which first flew over 60 years ago. So keep an eye on the diary. We haven't done the publicity on it yet, but that's looking like it's going to be 9th of November. So thanks for coming tonight. Really appreciate you seeing in such good numbers, and hope to see you at our next lecture. Have a good trip home.